Welcome to the annual conference of the World Pension Alliance. My name is Matti Leppälä, and I'm the Secretary General of PensionsEurope and currently the chair of the World Pension Alliance. The Alliance brings together pension funds across the globe, from the European Union and the United Kingdom to the USA and Canada, Latin American countries, and Australia. Each year, the Alliance organizes a conference, and this time it is online. The theme of this year is Transition in the World of Pensions. We will have two sessions. The first one is Pensions and Politics 2024 and after. Amidst a changing global political landscape, with half of the world population heading to the polls this year, the conference will explore how these shifts are likely to impact pension funds and retirement benefits worldwide. What opportunities and risks are on the horizon? And what regional differences can we expect? In the EU, we just recently had the elections of the European Parliament, and as a consequence of the results of these elections, France will have snap elections on 30th of June. The UK will have general elections on the 4th of July. The US will have presidential and other important elections in November, and there has been and will be many other elections in many countries this year. Pensions are often very political. With political changes, will pensions change and how? Social security pensions are very important and often very political. Funding pensions play also a very important role, and they are also subject to political decisions. What is their role in pension systems? Is there political pressure on pension funds to invest in something specific or not to invest in something specific? How political are pension investments? The first session will last an hour and 15 minutes, and it is followed by a 15-minute break. After the break, the second session will look at sustainable finance, global state of play, and future trajectories. Sustainable finance has surged to the forefront of agendas across the globe. Despite its prominence, concerns about ESG pushback and also regulatory fatigue are increasing. The second session will start with a keynote speech, followed by a panel discussion moderated by Matti from the Dutch Pension Federation. After the second session, Alex McKinnon will conclude the conference. This conference will be recorded, and the recording will be made available on the WPA website and e.g. on PensionsEurope's and other members of the WPA websites. Again, warm welcome. Now that the first session, which is a panel discussion on pensions and politics 2024 and after. We will start with a short introduction by each panelist, who they are and what is the pension system they cover. It is my great pleasure to welcome our esteemed panelists, Onne Steenbeck from ABG from the Netherlands, Katie Little from Pensions and Lifetime Savings Association from the United Kingdom, Anthony Rhoda, principal from William & Jensen from Washington, D.C., Greg Heisey, partner at George & Bell Consulting from Vancouver, Canada, and Caro Fernandez, Executive Vice President from FIAP, the Latin American Pension Administrators. Over to you, Onno.
Thank you very much, Matti, for this wonderful introduction. And I'm very happy to share my thoughts this wonderful conference that you have organized again. Yes, my name is Onne Steenbeek. I'm responsible for strategic portfolio advice at APG Asset Management. So that includes asset liability management and strategic asset allocation. I have a chair at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. I'm currently on secondment at the World Bank working on a project on home bias. And it's not something that's only that is limited to the developed world, but very much similar trends you see in the developing world as well. So I brought a few slides introducing the Dutch pension system. And as I'm at the World Bank, I thought it would be appropriate to use the three-pillar system to explain it. So we have a first pillar that's mandatory, organized by the government. Social contributions are paid by everyone who has a job. And if you retire, you get around 1,500 euros a month. if you're alone, and 1,000 if you are a couple. The only thing you have to do is live in the Netherlands. So you get the full amount if you live in the Netherlands for 50 years. And you get half the amount if you live here for 25 years. That's the basic income for everyone. The second pillar, where the most focus goes to, also in terms of discussions and what should change, it's a mandatory system. That's the big difference with most other countries. So most people in the workforce are linked to a pension fund, and they don't have a choice. If you're a civil servant, you save for your pension with ABP. The employer pays about half to 2/3 of the contribution every month, and the participant 1/3 to half, and in certain cases, the participant pays nothing at all. It's a fully funded system, mainly based on DB right now. I'll say something about that later, but DC is increasing in importance. And also the average is around 1,500 euro a month as well. But as you know, the average participant doesn't exist. So there are many millions of people who do not have a second pillar. And there are many people who have much more than the 1,500 presented here. And because of the fact that the second pillar is relatively large, the third pillar is relatively small. So it's focused on the self-employed and it's negligible for others. But it's basically organized through insurance companies, and you pay an insurance premium. You're on mainly on your own there. So the next, please. So the Dutch system is generally regarded highly. If you look at the Mercer Global Pension Index, then it's at the #1 spot again. It's been in the top 3 over the past decade or so, with Iceland, Denmark, Israel, and Australia. And maybe the next, again, Gabrielle. If you look at the assets saved compared to GDP, the Netherlands is also at the top. So we save quite a lot. I have to add to that we also are big borrowers. So in other words, individuals have very long balance sheets, big mortgages, and big pension savings. Again, the average doesn't exist, but this is the big picture. So I would say, well, it's pretty solid. But let's go to the next slide. So if you focus on the second pillar, these are more or less the figures. I think it's not precise, but you could say sectoral pension funds, the lion's share of the participants, as well as the pension assets, around 60 to 70 pension funds. ABP is by far the biggest one, but we also have one for healthcare, for the metal industry, for construction sector. And those 3 are the examples you see to the right. Then we have a lot of corporate pension funds. We used to have 1,500, I think, 20 years ago. So a lot of consolidation there. Still 300 billion there. And companies like Shell, Philips, and Heineken still have their own pension fund. Then we have a couple of professional pension funds, as we call them. So the pharmacists and the architects, they join forces and they have their own pension fund. So a lot of consolidation due to many different reasons. And it's still not where we will be in a couple of years. That's what I'm sure of. So especially the 150, I know that there are many that are already talking about either liquidating or consolidating with one of the sectoral pension funds, or another way they will disappear in the coming years. Okay, and then the final slide. So we have been talking a lot about pension reform in the Netherlands. So even though if you look at the picture, it's pretty much what everybody would like, I suppose, being at the top spot and having so much asset, but still, I won't go into the reasons why, but what the pension reform looks like. So what stays the same is that social partners will remain in charge. The trustees will decide on everything that goes on in the pension fund. Participation will remain mandatory. There will be one collectively managed asset mix that will also stay the same, which allows us to have a long-term view. If you retire, once you retire, you get monthly benefit payments for life. even though there are discussions, there will be a lump sum option on retirement, which is separate from the pension reform, but still, that is a new option with a maximum of 10%. And you get no detailed portfolio information on the individual level. So on the total portfolio level, of course, you have it already today, but it will remain the same. And there will be no choice options. So in that sense, it's very much the way we have it today. What are the main changes? The main changes are that you get an individualized pension account. So you know how many euro are in your personal account. And what is very different, because it's often presented this step that we go from DB to DC. In many countries like the UK or other countries say, well, we have done that. So what else is new? Well, what is new in the Netherlands is that the DB benefits will be transformed into the accumulated capital accounts. So we don't not just change the future, but we also change the past. And you can imagine that that is not very easy, and that's very contentious. And that is a discussion that is, and it's very complex as well. And we created this complex system of rules to distribute returns over age cohorts. So we distinguish age cohorts, we generate returns with this collective asset mix, and these returns are then distributed across these age cohorts with predefined rules. So we basically, you could say I don't like the words DB and DC very much in this context, but you could say we move from a DB-like kind of system to a more DC-like system. And that's, I think, the most precise I can formulate it. So I'd like to leave it at that. I'm sure we continue talking about the Dutch system later on in the panel discussion. So back to you, Matti.
Thank you, Onno. Thanks for your introduction and explaining the Dutch system, and the reform that you have here is, of course, a really fundamentally big one, at least in the Europe and I would say in the world context. And I know that it took more than a decade to negotiate and to come to an agreement and to legislate. So it has also been very political, and I'm sure we come to the political aspects in the discussion. Thank you very much. Then over to you, Katie. In the United Kingdom, of course, pensions have been very much in the forefront of political debates, and many reforms have been done during the last 10, 15 years and more to come. Please, over to you.
Thanks, Matti. And hello, everyone. My name's Katie, and I am Head of Parliamentary and Stakeholder Affairs at the Pensions and Lifetime Savings Association. So the PLSA, we represent UK workplace pension schemes that together provide a retirement income to more than 30 million savers in the UK. And our members invest more than £1.3 trillion in the UK and abroad. So hopefully you'll be able to see on the slide sort of the makeup of our different types of pension scheme members, the assets held under management, and also the numbers of members and savers that they manage as well. But I'm just going to give quite a brief overview of the UK pension system. So we do look after sort of your traditional defined benefit workplace schemes, most of which are now closed in the UK, but there are a few that remain open. Typically, we see these in sort of more unionised workforces. So, for example, the railways or our university system, we tend to find sort of our biggest open DB. We also look after the local government pension scheme, which is again an open DB scheme, but it is a public sector scheme, and it is the only one that is funded in the UK. So that falls into our membership too. And then we also have a growing DC market as well, so including master trusts, single multi-employer. And I think this is probably the most common type of workplace scheme in the UK. So by law now, workers in the UK, if you earn over £10,000 and you're also over the age of 22, employers are legally required to automatically enrol you into a workplace pension with a minimum contribution of 8%. And usually that's 5% going in from the employee and 3% from the employer. And I think in the UK, it's a really exciting time to be talking about pensions and politics. And thank you for inviting me to the panel today. I think when I sort of agreed to do this, I don't think we were expecting a general election in the UK until about November time. But now I'm sure, as everyone knows, we are all going to the polls on July the 4th. So the timing of this conference is almost perfect as well, because last week, all of the main political parties launched their manifestos. So we've got a really good idea of what pensions policy might look like in the future for whoever forms the next government. And, you know, current political polling in the UK suggests that we will indeed have a new Labour government. So if we just go over to the next slide, I've given a bit of an overview. Oh, Thanks, Gabrielle. So just giving a bit of an overview of the main themes emerging from the Conservative and the Labour manifestos, who are really our two key main political parties. So one of the themes I'd really like to draw out, first of all, is talk and discussion around the value of the state pension in the UK and the mechanism that we use to uprate it, which we refer to as the triple lock. So the state pension will always grow by whatever's highest in terms of measure of earnings growth, inflation, or 2.5%. The value of the state pension in retirement is really very important to a lot of the work we do around things when we like pensions adequacy, when we talk about retirement living standards. It makes up a good chunk of people's retirement income in later life as well, especially when we talk about things like Generation DC. And we're seeing lots of cross-party political consensus around commitments to the triple lock. So that's a good thing. I think another point worth touching on, and I think we're going to talk about a little bit later on in the panel, is this idea of pensions and growth. So trying to get institutional investors, including pension funds, to invest in the UK. And it's really been a focal point of this election. We're still living in a sort of relatively high inflationary environment in the UK, although that is trending downwards now. But cost of living concerns, the state of the economy, mortgage rates, these things are really at the forefront of some of our political discourse. So we're seeing quite a lot of, again, political consensus from the main parties around things like home bias, which I think Ono mentioned, building scale in the UK pensions market, consolidation, all of these things are a really live issue for us. And then I also just wanted to point out one more thing, which I think is a theme coming through. It relates to sort of ESG and net zero commitments. So we're actually seeing stronger lines, I think, particularly from Labour and also our Liberal Democrat parties, in making sure that UK pension funds are investing in an ESG-friendly way, that we're going to meet our sort of Paris targets, and we'll transition to a net zero economy. All of these things are really coming through in some of the manifestos and narratives at the moment as well. So hopefully that's a bit of a flavour around sort of the UK pension system and a little bit of insight into the political discourse around pensions too. Thanks very much, Matti. Back over to you.
Thank you, Katie. Very interesting, and as you said, very topical and timely to discuss this here. Can I already ask you, how important do you think that these themes, the pensions as a whole, how important are they in this election for the people and deciding the outcome as well, or impacting the outcome of the election?
I think that the state pension is something that, people are very, very aware of and they care about a lot. It's something that's quite politically charged when we talk about it in the UK. So you will have seen, or we've seen, all of our major political parties commit to the triple lock, and that really shows how important a policy it is. I think more generally on the pensions and growth and the home bias, which I'm sure others will touch upon as well, it's a conversation about, the UK economy, how do we get it growing again? And, pension funds have lots of money. So we're working at the moment to think about, what type of investments are going to be right for pension schemes, especially considering we've got essentially the main political parties both on the same page on this issue. So pensions and growth will be going forward past the next election, whoever gets in. So again, it's a really important issue.
Thank you, Katie. Very interesting. Then UK is the biggest pension fund market in Europe, no longer in the in European Union, but in Europe. But then over to Tony, USA is the biggest funded pension market in the world. More than half of the world pension assets are with the American pension funds. So please, over to you.
Thank you, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone out there, depending on where you are in the world. I'm Tony Rhoda with the Washington, D.C.-based law firm Williams & Jensen, and I've been working in the pension, specifically representing pension clients since 2002, and my work is generally leans toward the public pension side, so pensions for firefighters, police, teachers, and other public sector workers, although we do work in the single employer, private sector, and multi-employer world. And just taking a cue from Katie, with some exceptions that I will get into, pension issues in the US and retirement issues in the US tend to be bipartisan. And we've seen that in recent legislation enacted at the end of 2019 and at the end of 2022. We commonly call them the Secure Act and the Secure Act 2.0, but there was tremendous collaboration between the parties on that legislation. There are political footballs. Our Social Security system is certainly a political football, where the Democratic Party will point at the Republicans and say, you just want to cut benefits, and the Republicans will point at the Democrats and say, you just want to raise taxes. So that unfortunately colors that Social Security debate in our country. Let's dive a little into these numbers, and the numbers are large, but they lack context. So I just want to draw a few points out from these very large numbers. So if you look at the DB plan side of the ledger, you see governmental assets in these DB plans dwarfing what is in the private sector. And that is very much indicative of the changes that we have seen in the DB world, which is the private sector pulling back and the public sector very much staying with a mandatory DB plan. So when your first day of work, you're signed up, you don't have an opt-out of a DB plan, and it's employer and employee contributions that go into those plans. So that's the first point. Takeaway from this slide is that there's been a real reordering of where the assets are here. And some of those governmental plans, of course, the California, the CalPERS plan and the California State Teachers Plan, I mean, one is north of 500 billion, the other is north of 300 billion, enormous plans, and then some are very small. The second takeaway is just the bottom line of both columns, and you see how now in the US, we very much are skewed in the retirement assets towards account-based plans. IRAs, DC plans commonly, or most known 401k. Their sister type plans in the public sector go by the 457B tax code reference. But you see also then on this chart that the assets are very much toward the DC and IRA plans. So that is, you know, it's been a shift, decade long. We are not unique in the world to this shift. Some trace it back to the 1974 enactment of our ERISA law, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, because it added funding requirements, fiduciary rules, administrative requirements, an insurance fund. And a lot of it is business executives really want certainty. And they see the DC plans as providing more certainty and not an open-ended liability. I'll go to the second chart now and just do a very quick overview of how we regulate the plans in our system. And the US Treasury Department and its largest bureau, the Internal Revenue Service, have primary jurisdiction in those areas: participation, vesting, and funding. And I would say most importantly, plan qualification. And plan qualification under the tax law is what allows you to have the special tax status and benefits, where employer contributions are not taxable to the plan, to the employee, earnings are not taxable to the trust or the employee. And that in our system is both income taxes and the FICA taxes, which go to fund Social Security and Medicare. Our state and local governmental plans are governed by the tax code and not by the ERISA law. So they are always looking toward the Internal Revenue Service and the Treasury Department as kind of their guideposts as to how to run the plans. And then on the other side, for the private sector plans, the U.S. Department of Labor administers the ERISA law, and it has primary jurisdiction in those areas. I would highlight cyber as a new area that our Department of Labor has, in fact, made clear they view as an integral to a fiduciary responsibility. And they are also very active in the other areas, particularly on disclosures to participants, so that the participants are getting the right information and also trying to find missing participants, which is a real problem, but strides are being made in that area. And the last entity I'll talk about, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, which is the insurance for the ERISA plans, was created in that 1974 ERISA Act. It is governed by a 3-member board, all of whom are cabinet secretaries: Secretary of Labor, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Commerce. And it is chaired by the Secretary of Labor. So you see there's a very close tie to the U.S. Department of Labor through the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. And the PBGC, the last point I'll mention, also administers the Special Financial Assistance Program for multi-employer plans. I will get into that when we talk about politics and potential changes down the road. But with that, I'll close and pass the baton.
Thank you, Tony. Really interesting to see the differences between the public and the private sector in the DPDC, or who bears the risk. And then, of course, the Guarantee Corporation also being a very, I mean, it looks like a very political entity as well. I mean, subject to political discourse. And so one can see that there are many elements in the US pension system that can be very politically interesting and debated. So thank you very much for joining and for your opening presentation. Then over to a very big country, a very good pension country, Canada. Greg, over to you.
Thank you, Matti, and it's a pleasure being here this morning, early morning on the west coast of Canada today. My name's Greg Heisey. I'm an actuary. I've been practicing in Western Canada for over 30 years now. I'm currently a member of a director of MEBCO, the Multi-Employer Benefit Council of Canada. And I'll touch a little bit on how multi-employer plans have come to the fore in this country over the last few years. It's interesting going after Onno and Tony. I would say that Canada is a bit of a mashup between the Netherlands and the US, and you'll probably get that from my remarks here. We too like to call our system a 3-pillar system. We have, you can see them there on the slide. First, our old age security program, which is a residency-based system, currently pays out at around $700 a month and starts at age 65. The Canadian pension plan is currently at around $1,400 a month, and it is an employment-based system. Both are mandatory. Both get scaled back to the extent that you don't have 40 years of residence in Canada, or you haven't actually been employed for what we would consider to be a full working career. There are some political aspects to these programs. Prior to the last federal party getting into power, there was proposals to delay the eligibility age of old age security, which was scrapped by the incoming party once they were elected. So there are some political aspects. The Canada pension plan was improved roughly about 6-7 years ago. There was a moment in time when we achieved agreement, and effectively the benefit went from around 25% of an average working member's career's earnings to 33%. And it's a well-funded program. I think the Canada Pension Plan certainly has held out there as one of the better social security type public programs around the world. The challenge in Canada, and this is where I see that we've fallen back. Certainly, Onno mentioned the Mercer Pension Index. I think Canada has been consistently downgraded over recent years. We really have suffered on the private side, and this is where the consulting industry tends to spend most of its time. And it's generally as a result of the movement away from defined benefit plans due to the economic environment as well as other factors. We have, so this is a should be a rather large pillar in our system, but there are no mandatory rules in the country, at least across the country, for an employer to provide a pension. So we actually have a lot of Canadians who will only have their old age security in Canada Pension Plan. And I think that really hurts us on the world stage. Do we see this changing? Likely no. We do have federal elections coming up in 2025. But the big asterisk with our country is that we tend to provide the provincial pension powers to our provinces, which really, Matti said we were a large country, certainly in size, but not necessarily in population. And to divide effectively pension regulation powers up between 11 different provinces and territories can present quite a challenge. So we have quite a patchwork of rules when you think about it across the country, which generally means that we've got some significant differences depending on the province you're in. Next slide, please. And so just to give you a bit of an indication of some of the challenges we've had, you can see here in the chart on the upper left side of the screen that we've had a significant decline in membership in defined benefit plans, which is nothing new to those of us who practice around the world. But it's been a marked difference between employees in the public sector versus private sector. And so what we effectively have ended up with is a bit of a two-tier system where public sector employees have great workplace pensions from their employers, and they have the old age security and the CPP. But in the private sector, some members may not have a pension at all. Defined benefit has really been challenged primarily due to a whole bunch of factors, but funding rules and legislation have generally been anti-sponsor. Accounting rules and the requirements to disclose your liabilities on your balance sheet. Certainly the decline in interest rates over the last 40 years has been a large factor. But we seem to continue to try and throw challenges at defined benefit plans. Recently, very recently, we had a private members bill put forward on the national stage that gives deficits of private sector pension plans a super priority during insolvency proceedings. And that might sound like a good thing for members to have their pensions protected if their employer should become insolvent. The challenge is that those employers are going to find it very difficult to secure financing for their companies going forward. And so within weeks of that law having been passed, I've actually been contacted by a number of clients indicating that they will need to wind up their defined benefit plans within the next few years, which effectively the industry had told the government that this would happen, and they still went forward with the legislation. So that's a bit of a challenge, and it tends to be why you see defined benefit plans on the decline. The chart on the right, I've just shown how generally also we've seen an increase. If you look at the 40 years there, we saw a decrease in the average age of retirement up until about 2000. And then with the challenges faced, I think with the declining interest rates, as well as some of the other factors I've mentioned already, we've seen the average retirement age now increase. And it could be as a result of a number of factors. Certainly improving health could be one of the reasons why members are retiring later than they have 20 years ago. I tend to think it's also probably the challenging investment environment, low real interest rates, as well as volatility of investments and relatively high investment fees when compared to the rest of the world. So I will pause there and turn it back to Matti.
Thank you very much, Craig. Very interesting. And to me, I mean, you said like you would be a combination between the Dutch and the US in many ways, but I would say that many of the themes that you present here are really global, really the strong trends driving pension changes around the world. Thank you very much. Then as a last speaker, we have Karol from representing the Latin American pension funds. And of course, in many Latin American countries, this has been many reforms during the last 25, 30 years, very much shifting to defined contribution. Really, many of the things that have already happened in the Latin American countries are something that others, for example, in Europe, are experiencing similar developments and similar challenges. So very interesting experience from FIAP. Over to you, Carol.
Thank you very much, Matti and Gabriel, for all the organization of this important event. And good morning to everybody who is attending to this webinar from the very south of the world in a very rainy morning today in Santiago. I'm Carol, and I have been recently appointed as Executive Vice President of the International Federation of Pension Funds Administrators, FIAP. I also work as an academic from the University of San Sebastián in Santiago, Chile, and I have been working on pension issues for about the last 10 years of my career. And first, I want to introduce you very briefly what is FIAP. FIAP is a non-profit organization that brings together pension funds managers, both trade unions and individual managers from 10 countries, mainly from Latin America, but also from Spain and Kazakhstan. Totally, the assets under management of the pension funds of FIAP's members are around $730 billion US, which represent around 25% of their joint GDP. And the main goal of FIAP is to collaborate in the improvement and consolidation of pension systems based on savings, to provide adequate pensions to workers within a financial sustainable system that contributes to the economic growth and development of our countries. In the next slide, I would like to, Gabriel, please. In this slide, I want to show you some important figures about Latin American pension systems. As you can see in this triangle, most of our pension systems are very similar to the organization of other countries like Canada and Netherlands. And it's a multi-pillar system with a first pillar that consists on social assistance pensions, basically to prevent poverty. And this pillar is mainly financed by general taxes. It depends on each country, the coverage of this pillar, but generally it tries to cover the most poor people from the country. Then we have a second pillar that is a mandatory contributory pillar. And in this pillar, we have very different organizations depending on each country. So in some countries like Chile, for example, we rely mainly on fully funded DC systems with private administration. And in other countries, like for example, Peru or Peru or Canada or Colombia, they have both systems working together. A DC system together with a pay-as-you-go system that compete each against the other. So workers can choose in which system they want to contribute. While in other countries like Costa Rica or Uruguay, they also have both systems, but they complement each other. So workers contribute to both of the system, the pay-as-you-go and the DC system. And finally, in the top of this triangle, you can see a very tiny third pillar that is very under development and is a voluntary saving pillar. Then I want to show you the bad news. In Latin America, currently 10% of its population is over 65 years old, but this number will double in the next 20 years. So this is quite concerning. What is even more concerning is that still there are 25% of our population who do not have any kind of pension. So they don't have social assistance, they don't have contributory pensions. 25% of our population is with no support in their old age. But this is not surprising because only 38% of the workforce in Latin America contribute to Social Security. So this is we have very important challenges, and I think that is why politics have a lot to do in improving our Social Security and promoting sustainable systems in our region. This is all for me, Matti, by the moment.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you very much, everybody, for these introductory presentations. I think it makes it easier for everybody to understand what you are talking about, where you're coming from, and what are the issues. As World Pension Alliance represents really then the funded pensions, workplace, occupational, and personal pensions. So as Carol, you highlighted in the end the fact that many people within your membership, those countries, they lack proper pensions and also proper funded pensions. So I think one of the key questions with the aging of population around the world is the fact that Social Security pay-as-you-go is increasingly financially unsustainable, or at least much more difficult to manage than when we had different age pyramids in the population. It's a common challenge around the world, and then a key question I think has been for many, for some more, for some less, is how to increase the coverage of funded pensions, occupational or personal pensions. The terminology varies, but work-based, or then private savings you do on a voluntary basis for your retirement. Do you see, now opening the panel discussion, do you see this as a critical issue? I understand we have different countries here. In the Netherlands, you have traditionally had a very high coverage of pensions, occupational pensions, based on the fact that you have collective agreements, you have well-established social partner relationship, and 95% of the population have been covered by occupational pensions. But of course, the world of work is also changing in the Netherlands. So do you see the issue of coverage and dealing with the coverage as relevant for the Dutch pension system as well?
Yes, definitely. I think it's an important issue in the Netherlands as well. So indeed, I think the figure is a bit lower than what you mentioned. So it's between 80 and 90% is covered by some kind of second pillar pension fund, but the group of self-employed is increasing. And that is a group that is not covered by any second pillar. So there are discussions looking across the North Sea to the UK, thinking about auto-enrollment kind of systems, but the discussion is going on. So how to get them on board. And sometimes, like in the construction sector, it's a good example, where many people have been, let's say, leaving the company and becoming self-employed and being rehired by that company as a self-employed. So on paper, they are cheaper, but the only difference is that they don't have to pay any pension contributions anymore. So they're not covered anymore. So that's some kind of weird way of competing with your own former colleagues on price, and in the end, you pay for that yourself. So there are all kinds of discussions going on how to bring them on board again.
Yeah. Has it featured, that discussion featured in the latest political debates?
Yes.
In elections?
Definitely, it was part of the discussion coming to the reform that we are now implementing. So there was a list of issues that we would like to tackle with this reform. This one was not tackled. So I don't know, we didn't ignore it. I do think that a new pension system is better capable.
Yeah, we lost you there.
On board eventually. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so yeah. I think the new system will allow us better than the previous one to bring the self-employed on board again. But we probably need quite a lot of discussion on that.
Very good, thank you. Onno referred already to the UK reforms and the auto-enrollment, which was rolled out in the UK in phases starting in 2012. And and there was a pension freedom, big reform. So what is your experience, Katie, on this, and how is it politically now perceived? It's already 12 years since that reform started, and the coverage has increased, but are people happy with the result, or is there political issues that need to be resolved to improve the coverage and especially the contribution levels based on auto enrollment?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a question around coverage in the UK, especially with the self-employed also. And, you know, I think one of the problems we've got is there's so many demographics within the self-employed as well. I don't think it's going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. In sort of the current political environment, we have got proposals about perhaps reforming employment law so that we can bring into automatic enrolment sort of gig economy workers. So people like Uber drivers, they've already had sort of like a court case in the UK where they've been brought into pension savings. So that is an ongoing debate. But there's also sort of a larger debate as well for our, you know, people who are automatically enrolled in the UK who are saving into a DC pension, whether they're saving enough. And that's a really big question for us at the PLSA. We've done a lot of work and research on this, and we released a report a couple of years ago that suggested that around 50% of people are not on track to meet the retirement targets set by a pensions commission. So it's a really big worry for us. We'd like to see the next government set out a roadmap for increasing contributions over the next decade, and we'd like to see the amount that's put in by employees and employers levelled out. So we'd like it to raise to 12% and 6% from the employee and 6% from the employer. A couple of political parties have committed to doing pensions reviews if they get in. So Labour have committed to doing that. I think one of the big things for us is making sure that we look at issues like adequacy alongside some of the investment things or the investment conversations that are currently going around pensions and growth, to make sure we don't lose that side of it, because I think everyone's sort of political discourse is very much focused on investment and growing the economy, and we want to make sure that everything's considered. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Katie. Tony, you also already explained how the coverage or how much pension savings there are in the US, but are there also problems with the coverage in the US, especially in the private sector? And if you compare bigger companies or medium-sized or smaller enterprises?
Indeed, there is. So our private sector system is purely voluntary. There is an exception, there always is, but purely voluntary, certainly by federal law. And we have some 57 million Americans who don't have an easy way to save for retirement. And easy is defined as employer provided, because that's when the behavior, your auto enrollment certainly is a major factor there. But that's the easiest way for someone to get into a system and see the benefits of it over the longer term, is to have the employer provided model available to you. There is some push, I would say it breaks down a little politically to have a federal mandate for an auto enrollment into an IRA. There are leading Democrats who will see how the election goes, of course, in November. If they were to take a majority in the House of Representatives, would certainly push for a national auto enrollment into an IRA plan for employees. And usually they have some exception to that, meaning if you are a very small employer, 10 or fewer employees, you would not have to be under that requirement. The overall exception is that some states have been more aggressive, and some of the states that are left of center in our political dynamic, California, Oregon, Illinois, Colorado, there are 19 now that have enacted a mandatory IRA employer-based system. And those plans have been, I think, wildly successful. In just about 10 years, there are already collectively assets of $1.42 billion in those states that have gone down this road. The trick, though, is to get this broader, and into more conservative states. They may be able to go down a path where they have an auto IRA, but it's purely voluntary.
Yeah.
And that is not going to, of course, induce the kind of behavior that we'd like to see.
Very interesting and very relevant for the European debates as well, because in Europe, because Europe is not a federal state, it's a unique international setup organization, has legislation, but pensions for first and foremost belong to the member states. But there's also now a debate starting on auto-enrollment savings product in Europe, and also many or some member states in the European Union have introduced auto-enrollment. Ireland is rolling out one this year, and Lithuania has one in place, and there's a debate whether auto-enrollment could be a solution. But Greg, you also highlighted the problem of coverage in Canada, and also mentioned that Canada is not a federal state. You have provinces that legislate on pensions. Do you think that, or what are there developments in increasing coverage, and what could be the solutions, politically feasible solutions, to increase coverage of funded pensions in Canada?
I think it's twofold. I'll pick up on some themes that Katie and Tony mentioned. So first off, there does not appear at the time to be political will to do the kind of things that Tony mentioned with respect to specific states making it mandatory to have some kind of arrangement. That would certainly be helpful, and that would be at the province level, where a party could mandate something like that. But it might just be left up to the private sector. So a couple things where I think we can turn the corner and start to improve the environment in Canada that the private sector can do. We have seen a shift to larger, and this also picks up, I think, some of Anno's comments earlier, large private sector multi-employer plans. I work on many of these where there's many employers participating. Typically, there's a union involved, but there doesn't have to be. So these could be plans that get away from the defined benefit onerous rules because they're of their multi-employer nature. And there's a plan in the province of Ontario that's attracting just a diverse number of types of employers and industries from all across the country. So there, and those multi-employer plans generally are more defined benefit-like than defined contribution-like. The other area where I think there could be a lot more interest is we have focused or trying to focus a lot more on decumulation. So what happens during the phase when people are drawing a retirement income? It's fine to force people to save, but if we don't have confidence that they can turn that savings into a realistic income that lasts for their life, it's not really effective. So we have we tend to call them in Canada VPLAs, variable payment life annuities, where you've got effectively the mortality and longevity pooling. The University of British Columbia has had one of these plans quite successful for its faculty. So successful that one of the large Australian pension funds have come over and effectively copied the UBC model. I think it's the Australian Retirement Trust, which has 2.3 million members, 280 billion in assets. And effectively, they've taken this model that has been used at UBC. I would like to see those variable payment life annuities, certainly to address the decumulation aspect, become more prevalent in the country. I think the combination of the multi-employer DB as well as perhaps multi-employer defined contribution with those great decumulation options would be some signs for hope. It could be encouraged by a little bit more political will, though, as well.
That's very good, and thanks for bringing up the decumulation payout phase issues. They are increasingly important, I think, when especially, I mean, one of the big drivers for the importance has been the shift from defined benefit to defined contribution in many countries. And of course, introducing based on more recent reforms, defined contribution systems that are now entering the accumulation phase. So these issues are important. And of course, if the system is voluntary, then it has to be attractive for the whole duration of the system, not just the accumulation phase, but the decumulation phase is also important if considering whether to introduce a voluntary scheme or not. So I think that was very, very relevant. Thanks. Then, Carol, you also mentioned that the coverage is an issue, and you also, we understood that you cover many countries, and I'm sure they're very diverse. But is there any trend or any push to increase coverage? And by which means do you see improvements? Is there political will to try to improve the coverage?
Well, you are right. We have very different situations according to each country, but in average, one of two workers in Latin America works for the informal sector. So this is very concerning. And there are some countries like Peru or Colombia where this number is even bigger, with around 60% of the workforce in the informal sector. And we also have the problem of all the new kinds of workers, like the gig workers, and I don't know, many people working on social media that is very unregulated, and they are not contributing to any kind of pension system. So I think the problem is that the solution to informality usually takes a long time to revert, because informality and formal work is very related to productivity and economic growth. So the kind of reforms that we need to take are reforms that take many years to see results. So I believe that in given our current situation, what we have to think is in new ways to promote contributions of these kind of workers. And for example, I think Greg mentioned it, auto-enrollment can be a way, and this pensions by consumption, where workers can contribute a little bit in every purchase they do. These kind of reforms have to be taken in order to include these kind of workers in our social security, because otherwise it will take too long to convert informal workers to formal workers.
Yeah, thank you. It's not just an Latin American issue. Of course, it's the changing world of work. It has impact in many countries. Also in Europe, very different interpretations how gig workers or platform-based workers are considered. Are their employment relations covered by pension provision or not? There's European legislation coming in this issue. Also, in the US, of course, very prominent cases in California on these types of work issues. So I think this case is really important as the number of people who get their livelihood and income through these new forms of work is increasing, and of course they need to have retirement provision as well. So thank you for this. Maybe then moving to an issue that was already a couple of times mentioned, the home bias of investments, or the pressure or political pressure to invest in your home country or in your own region. For funded pensions, of course, really an important issue. Maybe starting with you, Onno, again. The Netherlands is a small country geographically. Not even the population is very, very high, but the amount of pension assets is very considerable. And I'm not sure if my figures are right, but I think maybe something like 13% are invested in the Netherlands and rest outside. And of course, much of it has to be invested outside Europe to have a full diversification. So and you work for the biggest of the big asset managers, I mean pension fund asset managers in the Netherlands. So I'm sure this is a very, very relevant question for you and your employer company. So what do you make of the political debate in the Netherlands and in Europe on home bias and the need to invest in European growth and as opposed to investing in a fully diversified portfolio across the world?
Yes, I mean, it's a very hot topic in the Netherlands as well at the moment. If you look, I think the data are the same that I have from the OECD, which is between 10 and 15% within the Netherlands. Of course, you can have a discussion on what is home. If your liabilities are in euro, then it's partly the Eurozone is home, right? So then the figure obviously rises quite significantly. But it's a big discussion, and the fiduciary duty that we have is to pay out pensions, right? So making sure that you get return for the risk that you take. And I know that in certain countries there's a second mandate to also support the local economy. We don't have that in the Netherlands. So in other words, if there is a call for more domestic investments in the Netherlands, we can point at the law saying that, okay, if you come to us with good investment opportunities, then we're happy to look at it. And if we get the proper risk-return trade-off, then we are happy to invest in it. Now, that's the situation currently. But still, there are quite a few incidents that we had a discussion with the local, with the Dutch government on this. So a call by the Minister of Defense saying that we should invest more in weapons, or as we call it today, safety. That is an interesting discussion. Recently, there was the promise or the agreement for Dutch pension industry to invest more in the Netherlands as long as the new government would leave the new pension law as it is and not change it. We will have a new government in 2 weeks' time. And they have been eager to adjust certain elements in this new law that we are currently implementing. But in general, I mean, there are also, let's say, objective reasons to invest more close to home. And there are all kinds of new initiatives to make that possible. So just this week, there was a new initiative to create blended finance opportunities to invest more in infrastructure, energy transition, and other, let's say, projects that are relevant for the Netherlands as a whole. So that might lead to a slightly higher home bias. In general, I wouldn't call it a big problem or a big issue in the Netherlands. If you look at the OECD data, the Dutch are somewhere at the bottom in terms of percentage home investments, but it's something that we obviously are part of the discussion. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a European debate now, very political debate of investing in European growth and economy and the future of what's in Europe called the Capital Markets Union.
But in general, maybe, I mean, if a national government creates the structures and the stability in terms of regulation and supervision, then it shouldn't matter who is the investor, right? So if it's a Dutch investor or an investor from the UK, as long as certain projects that we think are important are being executed and invested in, then it shouldn't matter for the government. And then we still have the room to create this broadly diversified portfolio to pay pensions.
So real investment opportunities for real pensions. So
not subsidy of certain pet projects of politicians. Of course, something we want to avoid.
Thank you. Katie, as far as I've seen in the UK, there's been a lot of interest of the government in recent years to have pension funds investing in, for example, infrastructure. How is that debate going, and is that seen as a political pressure, or are there really good investment opportunities in infrastructure or other investments that the UK government would like to see?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I probably just agree a lot with what Anu was saying, really. It's pensions and growth is a strategic priority for us. And I think there's one thing, UK pension funds do invest a lot in the UK economy, but it tends to be in bonds and gilts rather than infrastructure or these other type of asset classes where they'd rather the capital go. So I think a key thing for us is just reiterating to sort of policymakers and sort of some of the commentators around this is that pension funds exist, obviously, to pay benefits to their members, and they have a fiduciary duty to invest in their best interests. And so, excuse me, if you want us to invest in those sorts of things, then you have to sort of make some of these things more attractive. And we have got pieces of work ongoing. We think there are changes that can be made into the regulatory regime in the UK. So, for example, we've got a new DB funding code and sort of funding regulations that we're expecting later in the year. We've been asking for some of our open DB schemes and DB schemes that are sort of quite significant away from maturity. Perhaps they can have a more flexible funding regime as opposed to some of the closed DB schemes that are obviously de-risking, and it won't be as suitable for them. On the DC side, we tend to talk a little bit more about things like consolidation and shifting the cost element of DC schemes. So DC schemes are primarily sort of cost-driven market, switching that to a value-based market. So, investing in things like infrastructure may be more attractive for the members that they serve as well. So we do think there are levers that they can pull, but I think it's really important to remember, what I was saying is like, we need to make these opportunities investable for pension schemes, and so they have the right risk return characteristics as well.
Yeah, thank you. Tony, is this debate relevant in the US for pension funds, as US being the largest economy, and also, many US pension funds invest also, for example, in Europe, and I'm sure they're globally diversified. But is there political pressure to invest more in at state level, or does the federal government push pension funds to invest in the US?
I'd say it's less of an issue here. It tends to be an issue in the negative, in that we'll have statutory prohibitions from investing in certain countries. Iran, North Korea, Russia. There's a debate right now in Congress on outbound investments to certain Chinese entities. So I do feel it tends to be something that arises as a prohibition as opposed to an initiative. I would say prior to, in 2021, Congress and President Biden enacted a very large infrastructure bill, $1.2 trillion. I believe the enactment of that has taken the steam out of what was a small push on infrastructure. And it tended to kind of manifest itself with the larger state and local plans. And I do say local, thinking in my head New York City and Los Angeles, where there are tens of billions of dollars of investment monies. But those discussions really, I feel, going to Anno's point on fiduciary responsibility, they were really resisted by the trustees as to, kind of stand back, let us do our job. And we'll find the best investments. That's our legal responsibility, to pay the benefit, to earn the money, to pay the benefit. So those discussions really didn't get very far. And then I'll just tease in 10 seconds the panel you're going to have this afternoon on ESG investing, which is really a raging debate in the United States that we've seen it on all levels, from the regulatory to the congressional to the courts. And that is, again, that tends to be more in the negative. You cannot use these factors, but I'd sum it up that way.
Thank you, Tony. And clearly those are political drivers, so opposed to pure risk and reward kind of considerations. Of course, many of these investments have inherent risks that need to be considered as well. Looking at ESG or geopolitical risks of investments, that's true as well. Greg, how relevant is the home bias of Canadian pension fund investments in your view?
It used to be quite relevant in that we had a foreign content limit in this country basically up to about 20 years ago. And that was removed. And since then, I mean, Canada is 3% of the global economy. We're really quite small. We have seen the investment industry in this country flourish. I think some of the initiatives and the strategies employed by even some smaller plans, but certainly the larger public sector and multi-employer plans are they have some of the best strategies in the world. And we've seen a real development of Canada investing globally in private investments, whether it be infrastructure, private equities, private debt, etc. So we have a really well-developed investment industry in this country. I tend to think our fees are still too high for what we get. But thankfully, that has just been left to the private sector to develop. There really has not been government regulation on this front until recently. Until very recently, just in the last federal budget that was tabled, there was some indication that the government would like Canadian pension funds to invest more in Canada, which is a little bit of back to the future for me. I certainly not supportive of any government regulation on minimum investments in Canada, but one of the former Bank of Canada governors has actually been asked to form a group to examine this issue. He's a pretty reasonable guy. I hope that no onerous legislation comes out of this. I don't expect there to be any.
Very good. Thank you, Greg. Carl, again, you represent a great variety of different jurisdictions, different countries, and there are international comparisons of investment regulations, and in some, or in quite a few countries, there are still qualitative and quantitative requirements, and also, for example, limitations of how much you can invest abroad. I think that's the term. So outside your own country. What's your experience of this home bias and the existing regulation, and do you see any changes coming, tightening or making it easier to invest abroad?
Well, what we have observed is that older pension systems tend to increase their limits to invest abroad. So in countries where the individual capitalization systems have recently been implemented, they have very strong limits to invest abroad. For example, in the Dominican Republic, it is still forbidden to invest abroad. So they invest zero abroad. And in other countries, like in Uruguay, they have recently increased the limit to invest 15%. So it's very small still, but they are trying to increase the participation of their assets in foreign assets. And in other countries, like in Chile, where the system is older, we can invest up to 80% of the assets abroad. However, only 45% of the assets are invested abroad. So in this case, we can see that there is a home bias, because even though they are allowed to invest a big amount of their assets abroad, they still prefer to invest locally. I think the problem we are facing is basically in El Salvador, where the pension funds became the piggy bank of the government. And the government is using the pension funds to finance their projects and their expenditure. And even they are paying a reduced rate to their bonds. So if a private investor buys a bond in El Salvador, they give you a bigger rate than the pension funds receive. So this is a problem, because they are expropriating part of the returns of the workers to finance the government. So I think, as you said, Matti, that is a big panorama in Latin America. So you have countries like Chile where 80% can be invested abroad, and others where it's forbidden, and some others like El Salvador that is becoming a problem.
Yeah, thank you. And it's, you know, just to make it clear, it's not just the Latin American country issue. Also in Europe, there are countries that have similar limitations and restrictions. And also the rationale often, and maybe rightly so, is that when you starting with funded pensions, you try to build up also your own capital markets, and institutional investors like pension funds are important in this. Of course, then you end up with all kinds of issues, also very fractured capital markets. So there are pros and cons in many ways, but the political logic seems to be quite similar across the world in these issues. So thank you very much for this. We have covered two big topics here. Conscious of the time that we need to have a break soon, I would like to give each and every one of you the opportunity to raise as an example or an issue that you think is important for you in the context of pensions and politics. Starting again with you, Onno, and let's try to be brief so we can break as we have scheduled.
Very short, and I'm repeating myself if I say that pension funds are mainly exist to pay out pensions, and that should always be the focus from a government perspective. And that's what we see around the globe being discussed. But the pensioners eventually are the ones that pay and should also receive an appropriate benefit.
Thank you. Katie, what would you say as an example of reforms and political issues, politics and pensions as an example, good or bad?
I'm going to draw out quickly, I think, pensions adequacy as an issue, because it's something we at the PLSA and sort of the wider pensions industry, I'd say in the UK, care very much about. And we've been talking about improving pensions adequacy for quite a while. I guess an example, Matti, of sort of politics and pensions in the past, probably mentioned the pension freedoms. It's worth pointing out that we've got lots of work ongoing at the moment in terms of how we help people decumulate, which I think was a point that Greg raised earlier. So for those of you who don't know, obviously the Chancellor stood up in 2015 and said, if you've got a DC pension, you can spend it how you like in retirement. You don't have to buy an annuity. So we're now doing pieces of work to see, helping people decumulate. We know that people don't necessarily have the financial capacity to make very, very complex decisions when they come to retire. So we're hoping to do work in that area to sort of put duties on trustees and develop sort of whole of life solutions and products in the market. So that's the thought I'll leave you with.
Yeah, thanks. And that reminds me, the pension freedom, if one wants to have an example of a communicating a reform, which was maybe not the best way, was for the minister to say that you can use it whichever way you want. You can buy a Lamborghini. So I think that backfired a bit. Maybe not the Lamborghini, but what he said. So
only save enough.
Maybe not. So what about you, Tony? Do you have an example you would like to share?
Yes, I would. I mean, I think the graying of the population here, the baby boom generation still moving through the system, really continues to be a forefront issue, and an issue where there's going to be a lot of bipartisan collaboration. I think it has to be that way. The exception, and it goes back to that second slide, that special financial assistance program that the PBG has been statutorily required to administer, was done by all Democratic votes in the Congress. And if there is a change in administrations, I would think a Republican administration would look at that and slow it down, maybe seek changes statutorily. And this is for multi-employer plans that were struggling in declining status. Those plans, of course, are private sector employees, collectively bargained plans, joint boards, and industry specific or with a nexus. So I would say that is an area that would fall out of the bipartisanship. And hopefully there won't be many more examples like that.
Yeah. Are you still hopeful for bipartisan politics in pensions in the US. I mean, it's remarkable, as you said, that there is that was passed 50 years ago, was and has been bipartisan, even with some exceptions, as you mentioned. But do you see it as feasible to base pension politics on bipartisan cooperation?
I do, because of the demographic realities, and all members of Congress have to be cognizant and I think deferential to this aging community. And we've seen that this community make certain requests of Congress that have been approved. For instance, moving the required minimum distribution age trigger to a later age. It was 70 and a half. Over time, it's going to be all the way to age 75. Though that was an example of seniors going to Congress, specifically each member, and saying, I don't really feel like I need to be required to take all this money out. I don't need to do so. There are tax consequences. And so I think that type of thing continues. Yeah,
I'm sure you're right. I mean, demographic changes the demographics of the voter base, and that has a very strong political impact, which we can see in many countries already, in some more, in some less. Greg, do you have an example, a good or a bad one, you would like to highlight?
I think the major issue facing our country is probably the coverage that we talked about earlier. So I'd like to see some political will. Maybe we start with one province and then they fall like dominoes, which generally tends to happen in Canada. One province does something and then we move forward. So if one province could put in some kind of minimum standard for, an employer with over X number of employees to provide some kind of workplace pension, whether it's joining a large industry plan or even setting up their own plan, that would be where I'd like to see some political capital be spent.
Yeah, thank you. And then finally over to you, Carol. Again, there's been many developments in the countries that you represent. Some really in the forefront of reforms, like Chile early on, and then some really adverse developments. So would you like to share something that has been really bad or really good?
Yeah, well, I think that the more important risk that our countries are facing is that as long as the private pension funds accumulate large amounts of money, there are a lot of interest from the governments to take control of these monies. So we saw this in the past in Argentina, where the government nationalized the pension funds and take about 30 billion US dollars. So this risk is always present in our region, especially when the funds start to control a big part of the capital market. So the governments start to have interests in controlling as well the markets and even using the money to finance their expenditures.
Thank you. And that political risk really is relevant in many ways for funded pensions across the world, whether it's nationalizing or changing the rules so that you are actually trying to take over the assets. So we've seen many adverse developments. Of course, we've had very serious crises as well during the last years. But thank you very much to everyone who joined as a panelist. Thanks very much for sharing your experience and expertise and insight into this. And I think there are many relevant themes. Every system is different, the realities are different, but I think we have many same challenges that are the same, many drivers like the aging of the population. Its impact on the political side is really clear. Of course, the structures, what is the role of the collective bargaining system, for example, has a big impact on how the politics work. But I think many of the strong currents are common for all of us. So thank you very much for this sharing your views and for your time. And now it's time to break for a while. We will continue at 35 here in Europe. It's 4:35, but in about 10 minutes we will continue with the second session, where we will look at the sustainable finance issues and developments across the world in that. Thank you.
Thank you, Matti.
Thanks, Matti.
Hi, Catalina.
Hi, good afternoon, Gabriel. How are you?
Good, yeah?
Good, thank you.
Hello, Catalina. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Matti. Gabriel, you have my slides, right?
I have your slides indeed.
Brilliant.
I'm trying to manage the device. It's working.
Very good. So my watch is 35, so time to continue. Welcome back from the break. And now it is my pleasure to hand over to Matthijs Verstegen from the Dutch Pension Federation, who will moderate the second session. Over to you, Matthijs.
Hi, thanks, Matti. Welcome all to the next part of the program, which is going to focus on sustainable finance. In a minute, we've got an exciting panel discussing the state of play on ESG and the intense political discussions on the subject. But before we get into that, we have a presentation from Catalina Secreteanu from Morningstar Sustainalytics on the state of play of ESG integration by asset owners based on a survey they did. So Catalina, I'm just going to hand it over to you to present the results of your survey and give us some insights where asset owners currently are at in thinking about ESG.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Matthias. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us. My name is Catalina Secreteanu. I'm Managing Director for ESG Solutions at Morningstar Sustainalytics. And over the next 50 to 20 minutes or so, I will share with you what is, in our view, the state of play as it pertains to ESG and climate, and what are some of the future areas of innovation. But firstly, to set the stage, and if we can go to the next slide, as Matthias has mentioned, we conduct every year over the past 3 years a survey of global asset owners, where we ask them quite a wide range of questions, really looking to understand what is on asset owners' mind and what is driving some of their key activities. We are just in the process of running the study in 2024, and what we do is that we first start with a qualitative study, and then we go to a quant one. The results that I'll present this afternoon are some of the key takeaways from the qualitative part of the study, and we are soon going to the quant part, where we are surveying around 500 asset owners across Europe, North America, and APAC. And if we can go to the next slide, I think it's quite insightful to think of some of our key takeaways as part of these 4 hats, which global asset owners have told us they feel they wear at any one time. Coming from the hat as a global investment manager, communicator and influencer, steward of global capital, and operations manager. So I'll just take a few minutes to guide you through that and what our study has showed. Firstly, if we go to the next slide, certainly, the majority of the asset owners that we spoke with really view themselves as universal owners, meaning that they essentially invest in the entire market and cannot easily diversify away from external risk like climate change, biodiversity risk, geopolitical events, and so forth. And this has come up very clearly in our study and really leads asset owners to take a worldview and pursue an engagement-oriented approach to many of their key sustainable investment activities. And as you can see as some of the key takeaways here, asset owners are concerned with a number of macro issues that could have an impact on their investment strategies and portfolios. And of course, many of you could take the view is that, the macro environment is always really important, and of course it is. However, what we did find that this year in particular, there was a significant concern about what's happening in the world, and this includes geopolitical developments and tensions around the world, such as the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict, the Israeli-Gaza crisis and its potential impact in the Middle East, China's rising impact on the global stage, as well as global elections around the world. And I think actually the previous panel certainly touched upon some of these geopolitical events in different geographies. And the asset owners that we've interviewed really looked at these geopolitical developments as sources of global unrest and uncertainty. And we have also found that asset owners are inundated with new information every day, and they need to assess how this impacts their portfolios, beneficiaries, other market participants, and asset owners truly need to make a lot of decisions about what these potential impacts are. And if we really look at the next layer, the next slide actually captures some of the quotes of the pension funds that we have interviewed, and I won't go into a lot of detail here, but as you can see, starting from the left-hand side, one of the US pension funds that we spoke with was concerned around the implications of the upcoming election. A European corporate pension fund really focused on their exposure to China and what that means in terms of their future investment decisions, and obviously last but certainly not least, interest rates, which is a really big factor as well. Now, if we think about the second slide the second hat, I apologize, that I've mentioned earlier, is asset owners as communicator and influencer. And as this audience will know, asset owners are not just investors, and their role truly extends beyond investments and is getting more complicated every day. And this was really clear in our interviews. And the importance of managing communications with key internal and external stakeholders truly emerged as a common theme. And the slide here captures some of the complexities around the communication landscape. In Europe, the changing we are experiencing a changing pensions landscape. In the Netherlands, as one of the earlier contributors spoke, is the transition from a DB to a DC scheme. We are continuing to see a further consolidation also happening in the UK. In the US-based asset owners have really mentioned an acute communication challenge around ESG and competing political interests. And then again, if we peel back what some of these key takeaways are and reflect it in some of the anonymized quotes from pension funds, you can see that on the next slide. It really captures well some of these considerations from the quote on the left-hand side from a Dutch pension fund. That speaks about the transition from a DB to a DC. So that's a big change. Then the quote in the middle coming from a US pension fund. There are so many attacks and interference from politicians in terms of the fiduciary responsibility of public pension funds in the US. And the third one really refers to the engagement with the PRI. And certainly I think we are going through a time where asset owners and asset managers as well are really reviewing the resources that they can dedicate to some of these engagement platforms. The third asset owner hat that we have come across in our study is asset owners as stewards of global capital. And I think I mentioned this in my introduction to this section. One of the themes that has truly come across very strongly in the interviews is that asset owners think themselves as universal owners. And as a result, stewardship becomes an essential tool for them. Now, looking at the key takeaways, what's interesting is that climate really remains a key material factor. This was the case with our 2023 survey when climate change and integrating climate considerations in investment policy has certainly been one of the key areas of concern for the asset owners that we have interviewed. And as you can see here, certainly water and diversity are one of the key considerations as well. Governance has always been important for this market segment, and interviewees have disclosed a need for better corporate disclosures. If we go to the next slide, you can see some of these considerations really reflected in some of the commentary here. The first quote there refers to climate, which they see in the lead, and that's because the data that's available is better. The second quote refers to the data gap that exists in the market in terms of exposure to biodiversity risks. And again, the third component speaks to corporate disclosure. The last and certainly not least dimension of an asset owner responsibility refers to asset owner as operations manager. And I would say the key takeaways as we engaged with this client segment during interviews is that sourcing and managing data has become more complex and more essential. And along with having access to the right data, questions around what are the appropriate technologies and the appropriate platforms that are fit for purpose. I think if I can, sum up some of the concerns that were raised that we've grouped under this asset owner hat is really around how do asset owners execute on their commitments with limited resources. And this was a major theme. Where every one of our interviewees truly felt that they don't have the resources they truly need. So it's about finding the right partner or finding the right technologies to meet your needs. And again, the next slide peels back and look at some of the quotes here. I mean, some of these are have a sense of humor to them. Perhaps I'll just read out the quote from an Australian superannuation scheme. So you have limited resources, and sometimes you have to be the jack of all trades. You have to be really creative and innovative. ESG professionals often feel like they constantly have to keep learning. And I'm sure that if we have any asset owners listening to us today, I suspect that this quote will resonate with many of them. Now, before I go into the second part of my presentation, where I want to reflect a little bit on the regulatory landscape and what are some of the sources of innovation in this space, I want to take a few moments and ask the audience a question. So, as I've mentioned, we have identified 4 hats that may emerge in our survey. And then I've listed them here. And the question is there a hat that we should be diving into more for our quantitative survey? So as I mentioned in the introduction to my presentation, the insights that I've just shared right now are created from conducting a number of qualitative interviews, and we are now heading to the quant part of our study. So curious to hear this group's view, whether there's one hat that resonates more with you and we should look at asking more questions around what sits under the hood, or whether perhaps there are others, and if there are others, we can perhaps take some questions around that in the Q&A portion of the presentation. So I know this usually takes a moment until all questions come through, but hopefully technology is on our side and we'll be able to see the results.
I see people still participating.
Okay.
So let's wait maybe 20 seconds.
Yes, absolutely. Let's do that. Very curious to see the results. So Gabriel, I assume everyone can see the results on their screen, but it looks that Global Investment Manager comes on top, and clearly, as it should, perhaps one of the core mandate, but definitely Communicator and Influencer is a close second there. I hope that perhaps when we get to the questions portion, we might hear from the votes that went for other as well. Really curious to hear what we may have missed as we conducted the study. Good, thank you for sharing that. Now, I think whenever one speaks about ESG and climate these days, certainly ESG regulation has its own unique place, and certainly, the regulation in this area has accelerated at quite a significant path over the last few years. And not surprisingly, certainly it continues to evolve this year. For those of you who can follow the map that I have on the right-hand side, the regulations that have been passed are highlighted in green, and where also there's a mandatory regulatory regime in place. The ones in blue are voluntary, and the ones in yellow are proposed. Now, there are a couple of things. I mean, certainly in Europe and in the UK, we have seen quite some requirements coming from for pension funds over the last couple of years. However, I would say that certainly the most significant level of mandatory regulation has been focused on the wealth and retail space, and has really been focused on protecting or actually, yeah, I would say protecting the end investors from greenwashing and encouraging a best-in-class approach to sustainability labels. And obviously, pension funds and insurance firms, so the asset owner segment can benefit from an increased environment or far more transparency to what sits under the hood of some of these sustainability funds, but certainly some of these regulations or some of these requirements have not been directly targeting asset owners. And if we can go to the next slide, the recent label regime introduced in Europe by ESMA and in the UK by the FCA truly raises the bar in terms of requirements for sustainability labeled funds, with very strict exclusions in Europe in alignment with the Paris-aligned benchmarks for those of you who are familiar with these standards, and with a significant level of KPI disclosure in the UK. And certainly, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I would say that the Northern Star that the regulator has followed as these regulations have been passed is truly mitigating greenwashing concerns, as well as showcasing almost like pockets of excellence in sustainable investing as it pertains to the labeled funds. And maybe I would also highlight that these requirements apply exclusively for labeled funds. So, many asset owners will have segregated mandates, and how those are managed as it pertains to ESG and climate considerations, remains at the discretion of the end client, of course. But as it pertains to marketed sustainability label funds in the UK and in Europe, the level of requirements to demonstrate adherence to a label, both to the regulator and to the end client, are now increasingly high. Now, what does this all mean for innovation ahead? And if we can go to the next slide. Look, I hold the view that the most significant source of innovation does come from climate. As you can see, certainly climate-related funds are set to continue to expand and have grown significantly in the past 5 years. Not surprisingly, most of this growth has been driven by Europe, and the regulation that I was mentioning earlier has played an important part there. The EU has put forward with the EU Action Plan a really ambitious set of regulatory requirements, ultimately designed to encourage increased capital flows towards companies and sectors that were supporting a transition to a low carbon economy. And you know, certainly if you look at this graph, there's also been significant you know, development of climate funds in other parts of the world as well, including China, but Europe is leading the way. Now, if we look at what's under the hood, which I think is also quite relevant, if we can go to the next slide, is that we truly see a diversity of approaches when it comes to climate. And I apologize, this slide has a lot of information, so it's probably not easy to read. But if you look at the two graphs, middle and right-hand side, ultimately what it shows is what are the level of assets that have been concentrated based on the type of climate strategies. And you can see that as it pertains to climate, 4 different strategies have been primarily deployed by asset managers. One is focused on low carbon, so setting carbon emissions targets for investee companies. The second one is around green bonds. And then you have climate transition, that is the most popular strategy. And again, this is very much in alignment with the regulation that exists in Europe that has been I would say enabling transition strategies, but as well, climate solution represents a significant allocation. Interestingly enough, not shown here, but when we look at the underlying data, the climate solutions theme and approach has been primarily supported by North American investors. So certainly, I think what's impressive, especially if you think about climate as it has been integrated into investment strategies, that we've seen quite a considerable variety in the types of strategies that have been deployed, and an area of investing that has seen significant growth over the last 5 years. I was trying to reflect a bit on what would be appropriate ending words for my presentations, whether, you know, I feel optimistic or perhaps pessimistic of what we've been able to achieve. And certainly I do think that I really remain optimistic. I think that we are on the right track regarding making meaningful progress in climate change transition. And certainly for those of us who work in the field, it's likely not as fast as we would like it to see. You know, we have already achieved meaningful progress against some of the objectives that we as individual participants in the financial sectors have. I hope that some of this has been interesting and useful to you, and happy to take any questions. I think we have a few minutes available before going into the next segment.
Thank you, Catalina, for that very interesting presentation. Interesting to think of, you know, the different roles and hats asset owners are wearing. You know, coming from the Netherlands, I definitely see those different hats in practice. And very interesting insights on the developments across the globe. So if there are any questions now for Catalina, you know, please raise your hand and ask them now. Otherwise, you know, as people are getting over their hesitation, perhaps maybe I have a question. And I don't want to go into the next panel, which I'm moderating in a minute, too much. But you know, you mentioned the regulatory developments and ESMA, the FCA, focusing on sort of greenwashing. It's a global trend. You know, that's focusing a lot on the retail side, perhaps. Do you think this has an impact on institutional investors and pension funds as well? Do you see it as something positive or something that is challenging?
Yeah, look, that's a good question. I think it's probably mixed. I maybe to answer your first question, I do think that the level of regulation on, or the level of the fact that there are so many rules in place for what can constitute a labeled sustainability fund is going to create a more level playing field in terms of transparency around a number of funds that exist in the market, and that can also help asset owners as they are engaging with their managers or conducting due diligence, for sure. So I think it's a level of transparency that the industry benefits overall. However, from my own experience, I do think that there is a significant greening process of segregated mandates from asset owners to their manager that is also happening and is well underway, which is clearly, not reflected necessarily in the types of regulation or transparency requirements that we're seeing from the regulator. But asset owners as key financial participants will be benefiting from the increased level of transparency. I'm still, perhaps as you can tell from my hesitation, sitting a little bit on the fence in terms of what the increased level of prescriptiveness as it pertains to this regulation really does for the future of the industry. I think for sure it helps significantly with mitigating greenwashing concerns, and I hope over time it really empowers the end investor to think about sustainable investing perhaps more often than not, because there will be a lot more mandatory questions that they'll be asked, so investment preferences are better known. I sit on the camp of those that want to see more capital allocated towards companies and sectors that are looking at transitioning to a low carbon economy. And whilst I know that this is one of the objectives at times of some of these regulatory frameworks, I think it's not always clear that it will be easily achieved with the rules that we have in place.
Good, thank you for that. I'm seeing if there are any questions, and if not, I have a ton of questions, so I'm just gonna ask another one to keep the ball rolling. So we know that one of the challenges both in ESG integration and in compliance with some of the new regulations, particularly within the EU, is ESG data. This, of course, for Sustainalytics, part of your sort of your offering. What do you think the next years are going to bring? I know that European pension funds, looking at SFDR implementation are often saying, we don't have the data yet. How do you see this develop over the next years? Is the sustainability of reporting for companies going to help a lot, or will there still be patches?
For sure. Look, I am very hopeful on that front. I think CSRD will help immensely, especially as it pertains to raising the bar on corporate disclosure for European companies. So that's going to help a lot. Obviously, so many of the investors that we that we work with, and some of them was represented on the event this afternoon, are global investors. So having good disclosure from European companies is not enough, because they will have significant disclosure to other geographies, to large cap as well as small cap. And so I do think that it will take far more time until you truly have a global level playing field. But we are heading in the right direction. I think the last few years have been very interesting, as you will know, because investors have had very again, strict reporting requirements from the regulators, including on SFDR, given that their investee companies were not subject to the same level of requirements. But obviously that's changing now with CSRD in place. I would say for parties like Morningstar Sustainalytics, improving the data, the quality of our data on an ongoing basis, being well positioned to capture more of the data set as companies report becomes paramount, and it is very much our bread and butter. It's one of the areas of focus for us on an ongoing basis as part of our operational excellence. And I think we also face the challenge that as companies start reporting for the first time new data sets, they're not always at the same level of maturity or data integrity as those data sets that they have been reporting for many years. But I think as an industry, we're heading in the right direction. I think the question is, how quickly can we move to ensure that we, as a sector or corporates disclose, the key data set, especially as it pertains to climate transition, that investors need to be able to inform their views, especially as it pertains to climate.
Well, thank you, Catalina. I think that wraps up the time for the Q&A. Thank you for your insights, and maybe we'll get some response from the panel, as we have very knowledgeable speakers on regulatory developments that you just mentioned. So the next panel. Well, first of all, let me introduce myself, which I haven't done so far. So I'm Matti. I am the head of Brussels office of the Dutch Federation of Pension Funds. Prior to this, I was actually working at PensionsEurope, and I've been covering sustainable finance regulation basically since the inception of the EU workstream in 2016. And I'm currently also chairing the long-term sustainable investment working group of PensionsEurope. And with me today, I have 3 speakers to discuss ESG pushback and regulatory fatigue. Where are we headed to? So especially in Europe, the last maybe 8 years, the direction was sort of towards more regulation, more investments, more attention for ESG. But not everywhere in the world have we seen the same kind of debate, particularly in the US. The debate has been more contentious and very political. And I would say that in the EU, in the last year and a half, we've seen the Green Deal agenda of the European Commission slow down in some places, and people have called it the green pause. The industry has been very busy implementing the sustainable finance framework, and that has come with its challenges, complexities as well, how to deal with the large set of new rules and disclosures and some inconsistencies in the framework. So there's different states of play in Europe, in the US, but also in Latin America. So we'll hear from 3 speakers today. So first off, there is Flavia Michelota, who is a very experienced ESG investing specialist in Europe. I got to know her already many years back as the executive director of Eurosif, the association promoting sustainable and responsible investment. In that capacity, she was part of the first high-level expert group, which sort of set the agenda for the European Commission in 2018. And subsequently, she's also been part of a technical expert group working on putting in practice some of the European elements, and EFRAG, which is an advisory group on corporate reporting, where she also looked at sustainability reporting of companies. Secondly, we have Jane Moffat from BlackRock. She is the head of US state government relations. She has a lot of experience in public affairs at the state level, both at BlackRock and also previously at Goldman Sachs. She has experience in law as well and served as the executive director of the Canadian American Business Council. And finally, we have Daniela Moore, who is a senior ESG investment analyst at AFP Cuprom. She's in charge of integrating ESG across all asset classes that AFP Cuprom invests in, as well as she's working on stewardship. Before taking this role, she worked as emerging market equity analyst at the same company. So, you know, I'm really pleased to have a truly global coverage of the debate on ESG. And let's start with the place where it's the most contentious, because, you know, that's perhaps the most exciting, and that is the US, of course. Now, we've seen the headlines about ESG becoming almost a culture war issue in the US. So there's a very intense political debate about what institutional investors should and shouldn't invest in, and the extent to which they are allowed to incorporate sustainability factors in their investment policy. But what is the debate actually at, and what does it currently mean in practice for pension funds in the US? Are they allowed to consider financially material ESG factors? Are they allowed to be active or even activist shareholders? And how does the picture differ between red states and blue states, so states where Republicans and Democrats are in power? Jane, could you take us along?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great.
Perfectly.
Well, I'm honored to be on this panel with all of these esteemed experts. So thank you so much for including me, and happy to talk about the US. So thank you, Matthias. And it's so nice to be with Daniela and Flavia. So thanks again for having me. As most of you probably know, this sort of started 5 or 6 years ago in terms of a boycott bills in a number of conservative states. So people may not know this, but about 6 or 7 years ago, states like Texas and Florida created these laws on Israel boycotts. And that sort of model legislation pivoted toward fossil fuels, firearms, and a number of other topics. So 2 or 3 years ago, during the Texas legislature meets every 2 years, we saw 2 pieces of legislation, and they became known as fair access laws. They've since become known as anti-ESG laws. But at the beginning, they were sort of directed toward banks and regulated banking institutions. And the conservative legislators were really, really focused on firearms groups having access to banking accounts. So that's why they were called fair access laws. Then I think politically, they became so popular in some conservative states that the conservative legislators saw this as a political win in many places where fossil fuels drive economic activity, Texas, Oklahoma, and a number of other southern states, where we started to see these anti-ESG broadly, fossil fuels, firearms, a number of other social policy topics, address government contracts in the context of municipal bonds, public-private partnerships, airports, ports, and then also pensions. So pensions was sort of secondary at the beginning. It has now become the focus across the United States, both in conservative states and in states run by Democrats, by more liberal people, liberal leaning, which is, I guess, similar to what's happening in other parts of the world. So I know you have questions later, Matthias, about where we're going from here, but it's still a very active area for state legislatures. Many of the people who are European may not know that each state is sort of different. It's its own entity. They have their own legislative cycles. Most state legislatures meet at the beginning of the year, every year. I'd say broadly for the first 6 months of the year, but there are states like Texas and Montana that meet every 2 years. So as you can imagine, these pieces of legislation that are anti-ESG, that say things such as our public pension plan, our university's public pension plan cannot be invested with ESG goals, those things can have big, big impacts because this legislature only meets every 2 years. So we're sort of in that window now where things are still happening. Most legislative sessions have concluded for 2024, but we're still seeing the ramifications. And I think our industry in the United States, asset managers in the United States, are gearing up for this to continue. So I don't think it's going anywhere. I'll pause there, Matthias. I don't know if you have any follow-up questions or you want to pivot to some other thoughts around the world.
Well, I do have one follow-up question. To what extent are you able to say and perhaps to show, we have evidence or we have good analysis to say that, let's say, climate is a financially material issue. I'm not an activist. I don't have any views as to what green policies we should have, but I'm just trying to mitigate risks in my portfolio. To what extent can you use that sort of as a defense in those states with these laws?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I like to characterize it not as a defense, but I think these are just valid questions coming from policymakers where large asset managers like BlackRock and others, my former employer, large European and American asset managers, sort of didn't get out and explain that we are fiduciaries for our clients. So it's a failure on our part to explain that, like, we manage other people's money. It's not our money. We're not directing it where we, BlackRock, thinks makes the most sense. We take instruction from our clients. It's their money. And they're entitled to have their investments directed wherever they want, whether they're a European pension fund, an individual investor, an American pension fund, a city, a municipality. It's up to them. So we sort of lay out the options for them, and then they direct as the fiduciary, we act in their best interest always. And I think it was really a failure on our part. I think we left of organizations like my new employer. We failed to explain that. And the perception became that because some European clients and clients around the world and some US clients were focused on that ESG climate risk that you identified, Matthias, that we were then directing everybody's pension funds into ESG funds. Like, we were just doing that without consulting with our clients. Now, that's not true. So we failed to respond and explain. So these were really valid questions coming from the Republican-led states, really valid questions. And we are now sort of explaining 3 or 4 years later that we will invest the funds as you see fit as the owner of those public funds. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. All right, that's a good explainer of where the debate is at. Apparently the state level is really the level to watch in the US concerning these debates. So I'm sure you will have a busy agenda for the next.
I think so. The good news is it resonates well when we describe that these are not our funds, that investors can choose how to invest. If they want to consider climate risk, we will take that direction from them. If they don't, we will follow their direction as well. So really, it's a storytelling opportunity for me to explain that this is how it works at a big organization like BlackRock. But we had not done that, which is why I think we sort of snowballed in these places that you've all read about in the news.
Mm-hmm. All right, thanks. Let's move over to Europe. So Flavia, you've been a member of the aforementioned expert groups. An expert group sounds sort of like small, but actually they've been hugely influential in shaping the EU sustainable framework as we know it today. So a number of very important regulatory initiatives were adopted and have been implemented by the financial services sector. I've worked with members through SFDR implementations, so I know how much time and effort has gone into this. And I'd say generally there's been a very positive political agenda, a lot of support for this. And I think the sector, by and large, was also supportive of the objectives, but we have heard some complaints about complexity and inconsistency of the framework. So do you think it's fair now to characterize this as regulatory fatigue, as was done in the name of this panel, or do you think these are just growing pains that we'll get over?
Thank you very much for the question, Matthijs, and thank you very much for having me today in this very interesting panel and conference. Yes, so I could just answer with a quick yes and no to your question, but I'll try to elaborate a little bit for the interest of the other stakeholders today. So indeed, maybe taking a step back with regards to what have been some of the most interesting echoes from the political side of things at different member state level, from within the Commission, and then going back to the industry, investors at international level, not only in European level, and see how all that is playing out today. So, of course, a couple of months ago, several EU countries made or announced important budget cuts, which signified much less investments being available for the environment. This short-term trade-off compromised the chances of success of a transition that requires massive long-term investment, as we all know. And indeed, these few words, just to give a quick background around the political sentiment across EU member states towards climate, the environment, and ultimately ESG. But what has been the real feel or attitude of investors towards it? Indeed, put simply, ESG hasn't been yielding the desired financial performance of late, and the absolute necessity of achieving carbon neutrality by 2050 does not diminish investors' demand for a return on capital. And indeed, constrained by their financial fiduciary responsibility to their clients, investors are abandoning the preservation of the biosphere and biodiversity in favor of the search for yield. And after 2 good years, 2020 and 21, during which ESG labeled funds mostly proved resilient, suddenly in 22, performance was no longer as expected, mainly because of the fossil fuel stocks to which ESG funds were largely underexposed soared, while that of technology and growth stocks to which ESG funds were overexposed plummeted. And that's a little bit to explain what happened in a nutshell, in terms of what determined the change with regards to ESG funds and ESG investment. On the European policy side, and as you mentioned, and since 2015, of course, the Paris Agreement has marked the beginning of the necessity to frame sustainability. In a way, the financial system works, and policymakers have been determined to jump on the sustainability train in order to effectively tackle the menace of climate change. And to do that, they've been keen to take along the private sector, without which everything would be largely impossible, at least, from the finance side. And therefore, we've seen a very heavy regulatory spree that has created more than fatigue, but actually also a lot of uncertainty, and in some cases, even panic amongst the financial market participants. You alluded to just one of the most complex, I think, legislation, the SFDR, which has sent everyone in a frenzy. And for the past years, it has really made it so that everything, with regards to the way financial market participants of different kind worked, so banks, asset managers, but also, other parties not directly involved, but also indirectly involved in the financial life cycle have been impacted by the SFDR. And indeed, what we have seen with the SFDR regulation is that it demanded quite a lot of disclosures and also categorization specifically of what are financial products that deserve an ESG denomination. And just, thinking about categorizing funds under Article 8, that I'm sure our audience will be familiar with, or Article 9, was something that really kept everyone in the industry very, very busy. And we've seen different outflows that still underwent up until last year, because indeed a lot of fund managers were really scared. They don't know about the potential consequences of them not meeting the new requirements under SFDR. So they were scared effectively that the products that they put on the market were not really meeting the requirements of the SFDR. And so they thought, okay, what are going to be the implications? Indeed, maybe that was not a justified fear, because what we need to keep in mind is that, the regulator was really doing at the same time, making changes at the same time as it was issuing the directives. And so at the same time, which caused a lot of pain for everyone in the market, kept on making, different specifications. So issuing technical regulatory guidelines, sometimes putting Q&As to clarify issues. Sometimes the issues were not really clarified at all. Then calling for opinions and issuing no specificities. So it has been a never-evolving, arena that really made everything more complex and put everything more, everyone more under pressure, I would say. And so in that regard, and maybe the first question that you asked with regards to the different level of pace that the Commission has been taking, I would say that there have been different gears that legislators have been using in that respect, and that has, of course, being playing a role, particularly on the political front, because as you all know, we had very recently European elections, and we're still going to see how the Commission is going to change. The right-wing and far-right parties have been gaining grounds in voting intentions and ruling coalitions, particularly what we have seen in the last elections, and in conservative and radical right-wing parties are being able to challenge even the environmental policies, basically claiming that they're too restrictive. Of course, they're using to do that the dissatisfaction from the agricultural sector and the lobbies in that respect, and also they're under the pressure from industrial lobbies. So that is playing a huge role in terms of keeping much of the industry awake, while at the same time they try to reconcile all the pieces of legislation, because we've just talked about SFDR, but SFDR is one, though major, piece of legislation, but it's just part of what the European Commission has issued, as part of the Sustainable Finance Action Plan. And today, we've moved from an environment that was mostly normative. Of course, there were not real guidelines that were mandatory, of course, for everything that had to do with ESG for companies or for financial products. And today we have many standards in the making, sometimes overlapping at international level. There are a lot of collaborations taking place between, for instance, Europe on everything to do with the Corporate Reporting Directive, so the CSRD, which has, of course, impacts and interlinkages with SFDR. So it plays still quite a heavy role for financial market participants on how they evolve their considerations. And at the same time, the supervisors are trying to do their best in terms of making sure that they can ease the requirements, or at least make clear requirements for the industry in that respect. But yeah, I think that this tsunami of legislations has left everybody quite marked, by what the regulation can do in terms of sustainable finance. And just a few hours ago, the ESA's published again a new proposal that they have on how SFDR should evolve or could evolve in the future, which again signifies the extent to which everything is really, we're on a moving plane as far as regulations is concerned in Europe, and the repercussions and the considerations that need to be taking place for Europe, for international investors, are still quite important. And that, of course, creates, more fear and uncertainty, as I said, within the industry and the different financial market participants that are maybe a little bit fed up with regards to all these changes and would like to see some clarity, and maybe the fact that the new commission, whatever their political stand will not be really able to make much change before a year from now, realistically speaking, is a good thing after all.
Thank you, Flavia, for that overview. And yeah, indeed, I just saw the ESA report come by, but curious to see what it will say. So now we move to Latin America. Daniela, thank you for joining. And you are more of a, let's say, practitioner, less of a lobbyist or a regulatory expert. If I can be completely honest, I really wasn't tuned into the debate in Latin America. So I'm just really curious, how does the ESG policy of an investor, like a pension investor like Cuprum, look these days? Could you give us some insights in that?
Sure. Thank you so much for the invitation, Matthias, and also to have the opportunity to share a little bit more about Chile and maybe the LATAM context. Before I start, I wanted to make a quick introduction about AFP Cuprum because many of you may not know about it. So it's one of the largest pension fund managers in Chile and is part of the Principal Financial Group. Cuprum manages over 35 billion in assets. So it has been in the pension fund system for over 40 years. And coming back into sustainable investing, we started our journey in Cuprum to the sustainable investment integration in 2016, where we defined as one of the 4 pillars in our strategy or sustainable strategy, the responsible investment. So in order to advance in that direction, we signed the PRI, the Principles for Responsible Investment, in 2019. And actually, we were the first asset owner to sign in Chile, and the second one in LATAM, excluding Brazil. And this adherence to the PRI sort of pushed us to formalize and launch at the same time our responsible investment policy. So like formalize it. And this policy is based on 3 main aspects. The first, our objective in sustainable investment is to seek to invest in companies and also managers where we see long-term returns and security of those returns. This obviously aligned with our fiduciary duty. That's very important for us. And this policy applies to all asset classes the funds are invested in sovereign, fixed income, equity, alternatives, and where nearly half of the funds are invested directly in the local market, in Chilean market, and the other half through foreign third parties like asset managers. The second main aspect in our policy is the active ownership. We propose and vote in shareholder meetings of companies invested directly through a process that started long before the ESG terms or active ownership arrived. And also we seek to engage with investees where we find material risks or sources of opportunities based on our belief that these activities or initiatives create value. And in that sense, we don't divest based only on ESG aspects, and we don't predefine exclusions. And lastly, the third main aspect, I would say, is in the integration of ESG factors into our investment processes. We focus on financially material aspects, but also understand that there are double materiality aspects that may arise from some of them. And we take all that information into account when investing, together with fundamentals, valuations, technical, etc. I would say we're pretty advanced in local terms, but putting this in a more global context, so to say, sustainable investing in LATAM in general is still one step behind compared to other regions like Europe. And given that LATAM is still in this process of incorporating ESG more broadly, we haven't seen an ESG pushback or something related. On the contrary, we still see a positive momentum. What we are seeing today in Chile is that we are facing some misunderstandings and disinformation around what sustainable products and sustainable investing in general are. This becomes a challenge for all stakeholders, like investors, company, regulators, and also clients in their roles. So it doesn't turn into an ESG pushback or some sort of problem. But with this, we get the chance to watch and learn from the experience from other parts of the world. Like hearing from Flavia and from Jane forces us in the region to pay attention to them. And when trying to incorporate these new regulations or promote certain ESG aspects. So this serves as an opportunity to learn from those lessons. And Flavia talked about that sort of responsibility they have in the European Union to show what they do. So because other investors around the world look at them as reference. And yeah, one example in Chile, there's a taxonomy of sustainable activities on its way. And given the European experience with their taxonomy, the Chilean government is putting a lot of effort, not only on the definition of the taxonomy itself, rather also on the implementation of it. So I'm actually participating in a collaborative instance between the government and financial institutions in order to study some cases and discuss implementation issues that may arise. So I'll pause there. Thank you.
It is always good if you can leapfrog and avoid, problems that, first movers encounter. You alluded already a little bit to regulatory developments, so like the taxonomy. So what is currently in place, or is there anything new in terms of regulatory coming up in Chile?
Yes, indeed. Regulation has been an important actor and promoter of ESG in Chile. More specifically, there are two ESG-related regulations in Chile that are already in effect. One, established in 2020, it affects us, the pension fund managers. We are required now from our regulator to report on how we incorporate ESG factors in our investment decisions. We were very supported when it took effect of this regulation, given that we already integrated ESG in our processes. And we found that this was a very good way to communicate with affiliates and to educate them in terms of sustainable investing. We have now reported we have reported 3 times, and every year we obviously work on a better report and more complete version. And on the corporate side, a new regulation started in 2021 from the Commission for the Financial Market. This regulation affects public companies with that requires them also to include sustainability factors on their annual reports, making them integrated reports. This regulation is in line with international standards, with SASB and TCFD specifically. And this has been very useful for us as consumers of that information, because it gives sort of coherence and a way to compare reports, not only locally, but also globally. And well, this regulation is very, very important for us, given that the analysis we make specifically in Chilean corporates consumes a lot of this information. So it has made a huge difference for us. And what's coming up, there's a new regulation very similar to the one for corporates, but for funds. So the regulator announced it is already developing a disclosure regulation for the fund industry. And on the other side, like I talked before, this taxonomy for sustainable activities, the Chilean government is also already working on this new taxonomy and trying to implement it the best way possible. So, well, from a global investor perspective, ESG regulations on investees have been very useful in making a lot of new information available and setting common standards so we can compare each other. But of course, there are challenges like the quality and materiality of the information provided. But most companies started reporting ESG just only last year, so there's a room for improvement. But I think, or I would say the most important and challenging thing about ESG regulation in general is to find this balance between new applicable changes that promote sustainability, and on the other side, that too many requirements or not applicable requirements end up killing this impulse for ESG or sustainability. So I believe that there will be support for those regulations that find that complex balance between those two forces.
That balancing act sounds very familiar. I think that's what we're engaging in at the European level, and great to hear that you know, your government decided to first require companies to report and then only, you know, the financial sector. In Europe, it's been the other way around, and basically required investors to report on things they had no data about. So smart move, I would say. So going back to Jane, you've already shared some insights in sort of how the situation differs from state to state. Now the whole world is watching as the U.S. presidential election is starting to heat up. So let's engage in some crystal ball gazing. I will not ask you who will win the election, because if you would know that, you wouldn't be working here, but just going straight to the bookies. But what would either, you know, the Biden or Trump administration mean, do you think, in terms of the future of ESG investing for asset managers and their clients, such as pension funds?
That is a very good question, and you're completely right. I don't know who will win. You may be able to tell from my accent, I'm a Canadian, so I have no business weighing in on who the presidential election. But I think what I can say, and I like this question, it will be interesting to see, you know, I think if the president wins re-election, he'll continue on the path that he's on, maybe be more aggressive even, and maybe follow the lead of other parts of the world, Latin America and Europe. If President Trump takes office again, it's a very good question. You know, I don't think I spend enough time. I should spend more time thinking about what that means in the States. I'm obviously very focused on the US states, which is totally different than what happens in Washington, D.C. And President Trump has many followers who lead Republican states, but also many detractors who lead Republican states. So I actually think that it maybe won't change sort of the path that we're on in terms of the divided country and what Republican states are pushing and demanding of asset managers and financial institutions, will just continue because it's so politically popular in their states. And on the other side, I think we will actually see, no matter who gets elected, President Biden or President Trump, we will see Democratic states take the opposite approach and do more like what we see has happened in California, which is sort of following the European model. So I think firms like mine are bracing themselves for this real divide across the country. And I'm listening to my colleagues on the panel talk about Europe and Latin America, and we sort of have a little bit of all of this in the United States, because what California and New York are doing and leading on is the opposite is happening across the country. So we sort of have a balancing act. That's why I made the point early on about managing other people's money. Like, we cannot, corporations in America have seen that taking positions on these things is just loser for everyone. No one wins when corporate leaders take positions on sort of any topic, because the country is so divided. So it doesn't answer your question about who's going to be the president come next January. I don't know. Anybody who tells you they know, it can't possibly know. But I think we'll see this anti and pro ESG movement play out more and more and more. I think the E has sucked up a lot of the energy in America, the E and ESG. I think we're going to see the S and the G become more and more of a focus going into 2025. Particularly, I mean, this is not the topic of this panel, but many of you have probably followed around the world what's happening with anti-DEI movements across the country in the United States, so diversity, equity, inclusion. And that's sort of the next, I think, the Supreme Court has made a number of decisions in that regard. And so I think corporations and asset managers are looking at that as like, so maybe a year or two from now, we can have a panel on that topic. But that's sort of what we're watching.
And out of interest, as a follow-up, you mentioned that sort of as corporate leaders, it's a lose-lose to really get involved. How are your clients, so let's take pension funds, faring in this? Are they also sort of keeping their heads down at the moment, or are they trying to speak up and defend certain policies which they feel they might take out of the interest of the beneficiaries they represent?
Yeah, this is another really, really good question. I would say, and I'm new to this role in the past month or two, but the number of clients that I've met, whether they're in Texas or in California, the CIOs, the chief investment officers at a number of these public pensions that are clients of ours, just reiterate that they're focused on the best interests of the pensioners. So what is in the best interest of the pensioners and the direction that those pensioners want to go, whether it's ESG investments or whether it's pro-fossil fuel investments, they're very focused on that. So it's nice to be able to follow that lead, and they wake up every day focused on helping people retire successfully. And so that we follow their lead in that regard.
Okay, thanks, Jane, for those insights. So now back over to Europe to also look ahead a little bit more. Flavia, a two-part question. On the one hand, do you have any predictions yourself? Also, some crystal ball gazing. What does the new European Parliament mean for the policy agenda? And then secondly, what do you think are the fixes that the Commission could bring in order to make the regulatory framework a bit more manageable for the financial services sector?
Thank you, Matthijs. Well, I think that from what we've seen so far, the outcome of the election is very far from promising, and I'm a little scared, to be frank, particularly in view of the next upcoming elections in France, and how that can certainly influence, the elections in Europe at the Parliament and the Commission as well. But yeah, as I said, I think that inevitably, even though, and that's something that we hear more and more, the focus from ESG will be somewhat less going forward. At least there is a huge risk that will be the case. At least initially, it might be for the best, because indeed, as we said throughout all this panel, I think that the industry has been really shaken by the many changes that it was put under. Sometimes, the changes that were proposed were not really really fitting the purpose. And one of the main criticisms that I personally have with regards to how all this Sustainable Finance Action Plan was played out so far is that it makes it very easy for people who were not really savvy about sustainability in general, or even sustainable finance, to actually completely miss the point of all this regulation, and strangely enough, only focus on the ask. So, fitting perfectly some specific parameters when it comes to disclosure, regardless of the final outcome or, really what are we ultimately seeking for, which is, of course, more investments in the transition economy, making sure that we find solutions, that we can finance those solutions against climate change and our, real economic challenge today, which is really far away from happening, because, all that we are faced with is the enormous regulatory burden that, as I said, and as we discussed, financial market participants are really extremely busy with, and that's never a good sign for clients, who at the end of the day want to have or should be having those discussions about their sustainability preferences, with the different intermediaries, with the brokers, with the different advisors. And at the end of the day, if the legislation is just too cumbersome, well, we all know what happens, that those questions and those discussions will never really happen. And so for me, it's a zero-sum game at the end of the day, because we're really risking to miss the point, particularly looking at things they were at today. Then on the front of different suggestions that we can make, I think I was very happy to hear that, as you, from Daniela, that indeed the government is really involved and really feel like they have skin in the game, and they're really helping with the sequencing and the tooling for the industry. That's really refreshing, because, of course, as we both know, this is something that was completely missing from the Sustainable Finance Action Plan, unfortunately. And of course, more care in that respect would have helped building the credibility of all the directives that we have seen, and would have eased the tasks of all financial market participants, and as well as the regulators in that respect. We talked for a long time about SFTR. Daniela alluded to taxonomy. The European Commission started discussions already in 2016 with China about their taxonomy. And of course, other countries, Canada, for instance, just to mention another one, have already developed or being very advanced in terms of developing their own taxonomies. Inevitably, all these elements, across different states in different countries have to merge, because we might have, regional boundaries, but investors are cross-border, they're international. And so they have to be able to understand really what those legislations mean for them, how they can comply, but do it in an efficient way, because sustainability has to be seen as a way for business to be more operationally successful. So building the case for operational excellence, I'm a big believer of that. And if we just get lost, in the evils of just following the different directives for the sake of that, then we're really missing the point. And I think that there is still a lot that supervisors and NCAs at national level in Europe, in European member states, can do when it comes to not only telling to financial market participants what they should be doing, but also help them to do that. And I'm particularly hopeful when it comes to the ESAP and the way that, this platform for ESG and financial data will be able to really make this all Sustainable Finance Action Plan come to the fore and become a reality, which makes sense for everyone.
Good. It's always great to end on a hopeful note, and I agree that is a very positive development you mentioned. So before I'm going to wrap up, just one final, very brief question to all. You know, this is a global exchange of views. So you know, everyone should go home having learned something new from abroad. You know, what one key takeaway would you give in the international crowd from your region? What's the one thing people can learn from what's happening? Who wants to go first? Flavia, you're still on.
Well, basically, I already said, I think the main points of how I like to conclude. I think that regulation really should be there to, to solve a purpose, to accomplish a mission, and not just be part of what needs to be accomplished, without looking at what it can bring in terms of added value. And I think it needs to be really fit for purpose, and maybe the right sequencing would have been, of course, a great help, because sustainable finance is indeed a great example of a very complex issue that needs to be understood by many different stakeholders, as I said before, that do not necessarily grasp the basics around sustainability, that like the feel of it, like the basics, but do not understand the implications. So they have to be able to understand it enough to choose it for their own portfolios, for their own investments. And at the same time, advisors need to feel comfortable to talk to them about those choices that can be made.
Jane, your key takeaway.
My key takeaway from this panel?
Yeah, or what should we take away from the discussions in the US?
I should follow the lead of Daniela and Flavia, and if we could be in the United States steering in one direction as opposed to trying to navigate and balance all of this, I would love to be able to take that away. Maybe in 5 years, we have a lot of work to do.
All right, thanks. Daniela, final words.
Yeah, very aligned with Flavia and Jane also, but maybe add that today ESG in Chile still presents tailwinds, and there's supportive regulation already implemented and still more to come. That we haven't come with an ESG pushback or regulatory fatigue yet, but we are not free of it. So we have to be very careful on what actions are we gonna take next and to learn from the lessons abroad. So yeah, all this in order to continue in advancing in sustainable investing.
Thank you. Thank you to all panelists. I think we've heard hopeful messages, we've heard concerns, we've heard challenges on this global whirlwind tour on ESG. So I hope our participants have learned something. And that concludes the panel. And I can basically hand over to Alex McKinnon, unless Matti still wants to say a few words. Yes, Matti is on.
Yes, thanks. Thank you, Mattis, for moderating. Very interesting and relevant discussion. Thank you, Jane, Flavia, and Daniela, for sharing your expertise and experience. Pension funds as investors and other private investors, of course, are key players in sustainable finance and sustainable future. So as you said, many things yet to do, and far from over all the political and technical issues in this important topic. Thank you very much. Then it is my pleasure to introduce to you Alex McKinnon, who's the president of MEPCO, the Multi-Employer Benefits Council of Canada. The World Pension Alliance is a loose organization. I'm now chairing, and I think right after this meeting, we will have a meeting where then MEPCO will take over the chairmanship. And it's my pleasure to hand over to Alex for the closing words.
Thanks, Matti. And as Matti said, I'm the president of MEPCO. I'm actually pinch hitting today for our World Pension Alliance Vice Chair, Susan Bird. She wasn't able to attend First, I want to thank everybody today for attending a great thought-provoking conference. Even though we don't know who's going to win the U.S. election, it was a great conference. We've been joined by people around our globe. It strikes me sometimes that while we all live and work in our own jurisdictions and we think we've got our own unique issues, one of the things that this global conference allows us to come together, listen, debate, and discuss issues, and hopefully find that while our local problems are special, they're not unique to the rest of the world. And I would say that we have much to share and learn from each other, and these WPA conferences will continue to do that. So the theme of this year's conference, as it said in the beginning, as Matti said in the beginning, was transitions in the world of pensions and sustainable finance and the state of play and future trajectories. All of our speakers have provided us with an engaging discussion as we look forward to a lot of these issues. And, we've talked about a number of the common issues today, sort of the never-ending important task of improving retirement security amongst our populations, the issues of ESG, and the role of politics in our pensions. And we talked about the home bias earlier, and often at the contradiction of trustees meeting their fiduciary responsibilities. To our keynote speaker, Catalina, helping us understand the four hats of global asset managers and our optimistic outlook, to our many esteemed speakers that we've heard all morning, and our moderators. Cannot say enough thanks for you for taking time out of your hectic schedules. Actually, we used to say busy schedules, but that's another global issue. All of our schedules have become really hectic. And I've scribbled pages of notes on your wisdom that you've shared, and I'm sure all the participants have learned from you as well. I can say that for many of you, probably well know that putting together a conference is never easy, and combining that with one that tries to reach around the globe, it's a Herculean task. And there's a lot of people to thank who planned the conference. But I will say a special thanks has to go to Gabrielle from PensionsEurope for sort of herding us all and making everything work and getting everything all lined up, and done a great job. I'd also be remiss if I didn't say thank you to my friend Matti, who's a CEO and General Secretary of PensionsEurope, for his leadership as chair of the World Pension Alliance, and his great work in expanding the reach of the World Pension Alliance around the globe. We continue to look forward to seeing everyone and many new faces at the next WA conference. So I'll steal a line out of a movie. So in closing, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you've reached us. And I'll declare that the conference has concluded. And thank you to all again. And goodbye.